Okay, so now that you've been through some of the fundamentals in the first two videos, I'd like to take you through the key extensibility points that enable you to go beyond the point-and-click customization that you've seen using Visual Studio and the CRM 2011 SDK. The orange gears on this diagram represent the key extensibility points for Dynamics CRM. We'll start talking about the UI extensibility. I've already given you a quick introduction of how you can extend the ribbon. I've also shown you a little bit about the sitemap and how you can extend the navigation structure of Dynamics CRM. Next, what I'll talk about is how we can use something called web resources, which are essentially HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and other file types which you deploy to Dynamics CRM, and then introduce into parts of the CRM user interface to extend the UI to do whatever is possible with HTML, JavaScript, and CSS in conjunction with getting data through CRM's web services. So the core extensibility model for the CRM user interface is modern web development. It's HTML, JavaScript, CSS, making AJAX calls through CRM's REST-based web service. Speaking of the web services, CRM exposes both a SOAP-based web service and a REST-based web service, each catering to different usage patterns. And as I mentioned, it's the REST-based services that most people use when extending the CRM user interface, because the REST service exposes a JavaScript-friendly API. However, external applications can call into CRM through CRM's SOAP-based web service and fundamentally accomplish anything that you can accomplish through the CRM user interface, because the web services layer exposes all of CRM's functionality, constrained here by the role-based security model based on the user that authenticates to the web service. While web resources are the primary extensibility model for the CRM user interface, it's also possible to integrate custom ASP.NET, or for that matter, any externally hosted technology that can be integrated into the CRM UI through an iframe and is configured for single sign-on. And I always think of this as the extensibility escape hatch. While there's quite a bit you can do with HTML, web resources, JavaScript, and CSS, there's always the edge case where you need to do something that requires a little more server-side programming infrastructure that CRM's web resources don't provide. And typically that means .NET developers building ASP.NET web pages that integrate through iframes, again, that have been configured for single sign-on. And the real trick here is that CRM's web services layer provides a provision to have that external application connect using a system account, but impersonate a particular CRM user by passing in key information to the web service call, which then causes CRM to execute within the context of that CRM user, enforcing their security configuration for a given web service call. You also saw building reporting service reports using the report wizard, and I'm sure you noticed that the report wizard doesn't open up the full reporting capabilities of SQL Server reporting services. But because these are just SQL Server reporting services reports, anyone who understands how to build a SQL Server reporting services report can leverage the full capabilities of SQL Server reporting services to build the kind of rich reports they're familiar with building. When you're building reporting services reports, you have two query language options. The first one is to use something called the filtered SQL views. And these are literally SQL Server views in the CRM database, which represent your entities, but are filtered based on the security model defined at CRM's application layer. This also allows, in an on-premise environment, any business intelligence technology that understands how to interact with SQL Server from a read perspective, the ability to query CRM data. So if you need to perform an extract, transform, and load process from Dynamics CRM to, say, a data warehouse using something like SQL Server Integration Services, it's as simple as pulling the data out through this filtered SQL views and bringing it into your data warehouse. The other query option we have is something called Fetch XML. And Fetch XML is a query language that goes through CRM's web services layer. And in fact, if you're working in CRM Online, Fetch XML is your only query language option. CRM on premises, you have the ability of using filtered views or Fetch XML. As I mentioned previously, Dynamics CRM has a very rich web services layer, and in fact, the general mantra with Dynamics CRM is that everything goes through the web services layer. So the CRM UI goes through the web services layer, reports either go through the web services layer or have direct access to the filtered SQL views, external applications go through the web services layer, and so Dynamics CRM provides a mechanism for .NET developers to add their own business logic behind the web services layer. And there are really two categories of business logic that you can implement. One is what we call plugins, and there are two types. The other mechanism is with workflows, and .NET developers can build custom workflow activities that power users can use inside of the workflows that they've composed. So if you think of the workflow designer that you saw previously and all those shapes and actions and activities that you can do on the workflow designer, a .NET developer can go ahead and augment or add to your list of options on that designer. And the canonical example is making a call to an external business rules engine or an external web service that provides you some results, and based on those results, you go down a certain workflow branch. Plugins are a mechanism for you to be able to, as I mentioned, put business logic behind the web services. Now, workflows fire asynchronously and react to interaction with entities, and you saw a little bit of that earlier. Plugins can either fire synchronously, so as an entity is being created, retrieved, updated, deleted, or asynchronously and executed at a later time. So without even having to understand asynchronous programming and concepts like dropping messages in queues and reacting to those messages and taking action based on those messages, etc., all that complexity inherent in decoupled asynchronous programming, Dynamics CRM makes it transparent to the developer, and they literally just have to mark their plugin for asynchronous execution, and Dynamics CRM takes care of the rest. And once you understand the permutation and combination of places that your .NET business logic can execute behind the web services layer, you really start to realize the power of the plugin infrastructure and extensibility in Dynamics CRM. So to recap that, we have web resources, which allow you to extend the user interface. You can build full-fledged SQL Server reporting services reports, which either query using Fetch XML going through the web services layer or Direct SQL going through the filtered views, both of which are constrained by CRM security configuration. You can extend CRM's user interface with any external web-based application which can be configured for single sign-on and call back through the web services layer. And you can build business logic behind the web services in the form of what we call .NET plugins and workflow activities. So let's take a look at these extensibility mechanisms in action. All right, so we're back at our XRM Nutshell demo application. I'm logged in as the administrator. If I come over here to Settings, and I select Solutions, and I open up our XRM Nutshell solution, notice I come in here and I can create a new web resource. And notice that we have multiple types of web resources that I hinted at earlier. You have HTML web resources, CSS web resources, JavaScript web resources, images, XML. You can even use things like Silverlight as well as XSL style sheets. And literally what web resources are just files that you deploy to the CRM server. And if you've got a scaled out CRM farm, the CRM farm infrastructure takes care of making sure those files get, for example, to all of your web servers in your farm. If I wanted to, I could come in here and I could use a naming convention the SDK recommends. And let's name this /script/hello.js. I could say that this is a JavaScript file. I can even pull it up in a little text editor, and I have some basic notepad editing for JavaScript files. So I could start typing, JavaScript code in here. And you kind of get the idea. However, most developers don't want to go back to notepad coding. And so while this has its uses, what most developers want to do is use Visual Studio. So I'm just going to go ahead and close this out. We haven't created anything yet, as we have no web resources. So I'm going to come over to Visual Studio. I've installed what's called the Developer Toolkit for Dynamics CRM. And this gives us a set of templates for Dynamics CRM development. I've selected the Dynamics CRM package template, and this is going to represent the web resources which get deployed to our CRM solution package. And remember, CRM solution packages are these things over here. And we created our own solution package, which is going to serve as our unit of export for all the customizations that we've been working on. All right, so I've named this XRM Nutshell just for consistency, and I'm going to click OK. Notice I get this dialog, and I'm going to connect to my CRM server. Since I'm using Windows authentication in my local development environment, I'm just going to use my default credentials. This is going to use CRM's discovery service to give me a list of the CRM organizations, or you can think of these as just the applications deployed to the CRM farm that my user account has access to. So I'll go ahead and pick my XRM Nutshell organization, and I'll pick my XRM Nutshell solution, which again, this represents the organization, and this is the solution. So maybe a little confusing because I use the same name, but hopefully you understand the differentiation there. So okay, click OK. If I pull up the View option, notice that I have this thing called CRM Explore. If I select this, what you'll see here is that I have integrated into Visual Studio a view of my CRM organization. And I can look at all the entities that I, the logged in user, have access to. Things like option sets, which you've already learned a little bit about, web resources, the workflows and dialogues that you implement, security roles, field security profiles, which we really didn't get into in great detail. But you see that you've got an integrated view into Visual Studio here. And so, for example, if I pull up that parent entity, I can just double click it. And right inside Visual Studio, it takes me to the configuration for that entity. And I can do all the things that I can do with the browser, but right from within Visual Studio. But in my case, I want to use Visual Studio as a way to author these things we call web resources, right? That HTML, JavaScript, CSS, etc., which is the key UI extensibility point for Dynamics CRM. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to add a new item. It's an HTML page. So we'll just call this, we'll start with HTML. So I'll just call this hello.htm. And at this point, this is just standard HTML, right? So I can come in here and look at the properties of this page. And this has additional information about what to do when we deploy this to CRM. Notice I have a build action of CRM web resource. And I like to call the display name the same as the file name. So this is the name of the file on disk. this is the name of what it's going to be called over here, display name in the CRM UI. And then this is its unique name. And there's a special naming convention in the CRM SDK so that you can use relative referencing of things like JavaScript files, etc. And so I'm going to follow that naming convention. I'm going to say /hello.htm. And then I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to type in an H1 and notice that I have all the benefits of Visual Studio's IntelliSense. And we'll just call this hello. So at this point, I'm using Visual Studio to build out some HTML. All right, so now what I can do is I can come in here and I can right click and select deploy. Now what this is going to do is it's going to take this HTML file that's sitting here in Visual Studio and it's going to deploy it to the CRM server. So notice if I come over here to CRM Explore, I can see that there is in fact a hello HTML file that's deployed to the CRM server. And I can look at its details right within here. Notice what you see down here. This is the actual URL that hello.htm gets served from the CRM web servers. So it's got my solution prefix /hello.htm, and that was dictated by the naming convention that I used. I can also go over here to CRM Explorer and jump straight to my solution if I don't already have it open in the browser. In my case, I already did. But there it is. And notice that in my web resources section, I can see that I have hello HTM. Right, so now I can either go into Visual Studio and work integrated, or I can work within the browser. In this case, I'm just going to work within the browser because I'm here. So let's find our parent entity and let's edit its form. And so now I can use this web resource in a form. So I can say insert web resource and I'll find it. So I'll just go ahead and select it, click OK, give it a name. If I wanted to give it a label, it'll default to whatever the name you give it is. You can specify whether you want to display it on the form or not. There's a bunch of advanced formatting options here. What I'm going to do for now is I'm just going to come over here and put it across 2 columns. We're going to give it, let's say, 2 rows, and I don't want it to scroll, and I don't want to display a border on it. So I'll click OK. I can save and close this. Now I can publish the changes to this entity. So now if I come over to my workplace and I open one of these forms, you see the word hello. And so this is the foundational building block of extending the CRM user interface. It starts where all modern web development starts, and that's with HTML. And the way that you enhance HTML for richer interactivity is you use JavaScript. So I'm going to come back over to Visual Studio, and we're going to add another web resource here. We'll just call this hello.htm.js. And this is a naming convention I use to help you know that this is just a JavaScript file, which is sort of the code behind or code beside or unobtrusive code, depending on the terminology you use, for that HTML page. And again, I want to use these naming conventions, so I'm going to come over here to my properties, change that to JS, and that, notice what I'm going to do here. I'm going to do /scripts /hello.htm.js. And this will make sense in just a second. So I'm going to copy this. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to hello.htm, and I'm going to just add a script reference. In this case, my source is going to be scripts hello htm.js. Now remember, if we look at the solution and we go back to the web resources section, hello.htm, the URL it's served up from is dk/webresources/dkdt_/hello.htm. And so since that's where this page is served up from, we want to be able to have a relative reference to scripts/hello.htm.js. And that's why I named this the way that I did. And so most modern web developers develop with, when they're interacting with their own HTML, they develop with jQuery. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add an existing item. I'm just going to grab a copy of jQuery. I'm sure I have one here. And I'm also going to grab the jQuery VS-Doc file. Now this we actually want to deploy to CRM. So I'm going to use my same naming convention that we've been using before, /scripts/jQuery.min.js. I'm going to copy that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Visual Studio, don't deploy this file to CRM. So if you're familiar with VS-Doc files, they give you JavaScript IntelliSense. So I'm going to say build action is none. And what that's going to do is it's going to cause CRM to not deploy this file. So now I can come over to hello.htm.js. I'm going to do something that most jQuery developers are familiar with. I'm going to say document ready. And we'll just do something very simple, right? We'll say, alert hello. Now, I'm not doing anything radical here just yet, but you kind of get the idea. These are the basic building blocks of modern client-side web development, and they're the basic building blocks of CRM UI extensibility. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to say deploy. If I come over to my parent form here and I refresh this now, notice that it didn't give me the alert. Well, why is that? Because this web resource has been deployed but not published. So we'll just come over to hello.htm and we'll publish it. We made changes to it, so after your first deployment, you have to make sure you publish it. So now if I refresh this, you'll see that we get that JavaScript alert. So what you're going to continue to see as we go through this is once you understand the core extensibility points, you'll be able to then augment the CRM UI with whatever custom user interface you want. And while web resources can be plugged into forms, they can also be plugged in, for example, as what gets loaded in this form right here based on clicking on navigation items in the sitemap. So for example, if we go back and close this one out, and if we go back over to the 311 accelerator that I showed you in the first video, this map link here just loaded up a web resource. But wiring up to your own custom HTML wouldn't be extremely valuable unless you could do more. And in fact, you can. We provide you an API in the form for you to interact with from your client-side JavaScript to interact with data in the form, whether it be visible data in the form, hidden data in the form, etc. So to show that in action, let's come over here. And for now, I'm just going to comment out this alert. I'm going to add another script. It's a JScript file. And I'm going to call this one parent form.js. And this time I'm going to create a function called dkdt underscore form load. And I'll just put an alert in this one as well. Alert hello from form load event. So you can probably guess what I want to do. I want to wire up the call to this function right here from the CRM forms load event. And so I'm going to come over, customize this form. And notice on my form properties, I have the ability to add a library. I haven't deployed this yet, so you won't see it. But once I've added a library, I can wire up form load events. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Let's go back over to Visual Studio. Before we actually deploy this, let's go ahead and change this, and we'll call this parent form.js. And let's call this scripts slash forms slash parent form.js. All right, I'll save this. We'll go ahead and deploy it. That deploy succeeded, so let's go back over to CRM. We can see that that form's now there, that form script. I'm going to come back to my form designer here. This time I'm going to go ahead and wire up that form script. Click OK. And then we're going to say for the forms on load event, we want to call a function. And that function is called dkdt underscore form load. Now there's a lot more that you can do with form scripts, and again, we're just trying to get you through the mechanics of understanding the extensibility points of dynamic CRM. So I'm not going to go into all the advanced topics here, but if I go ahead and click OK, save and close this, we'll go ahead and publish the entity, refresh the form by hitting F5 in the browser. What you'll notice is that this time I get a message, but what I want you to understand is that this hello from the form load event came not from an HTML web resource embedded in the page that's wired up to JavaScript, but from the actual CRM's form load event. And so this just introduces you to the idea that the CRM form and controls on the form have events that you can wire up JavaScript code to. And in fact, we ship a JavaScript API called XRM Page, which allows you to interact with this form. So let's see that in action. So I could come in here and I could start typing xrm.page, but notice that I'm not getting IntelliSense for that because I don't have a VS-Doc file. So there's a VS-Doc file that you can download, and I'm going to add it to my project here. So going to my tools, and similarly I'm going to mark the properties of this so that this doesn't get deployed to CRM. And now I can go ahead and use standard Visual Studio practices to get IntelliSense. So I'm going to come in here and do my triple reference path is equal to xrmpage.vsdoc. So now I can type xrm.page.getAttribute, for example, is one of the many functions that exist in here. And what I want to do is I want to get the attribute value, let's say name. And so I'm going to come over here, and the programmatic name is for that is dkdt underscore name. I say get value. And then we'll just alert that value. go ahead and deploy. We'll go ahead and publish parent form.js because it's changed. And now if I refresh this, my alert actually extracted the value out of the CRM form, and I just gave us an alert for it. So once you understand these basic HTML building blocks, then you can understand how you can do certain things such as showing, hiding things in the form. So here's a very simple example of doing that, right? Once you understand how this client-side API works, if I open up one of these new forms here, you'll notice that I can do things like show and hide things in the form. You can show and hide sections of the form, collapse tabs, do all sorts of interesting things. And so that brings us to be able to do things such as for example, displaying an interactive map on a form. Notice on each one of these examples, I've got different maps that load based on information about this entity. And so in this example, it's actually a combination of HTML web resources to show both an interactive JavaScript map and a static image, as well as using a CRM plugin, which remember is server-side code. Okay, so we just covered the fundamentals of extensibility through web resources. Next, we're going to look at building a .NET plugin. So web resources live inside the browser. They get served from the CRM web server, and they can interact back through CRM web services. .NET plugins live behind the web services. So before we actually look at plugins, let's take a look at the CRM web services. Okay, so we're back in our XRM Nutshell demo app here, and then select Customizations, and click Developer Resources. You get some very important information for CRM developers. You'll notice that you get information about where the various web service endpoints are. And notice that there's that SOAP service, and then there's our REST service, which is based on the Open Data Protocol, or OData. But what we want to look at is how we can put our own .NET business logic that sits behind that web services layer. So to do that, I'm going to come in and add a new project. And this time I'm going to select the Dynamics CRM 2011 plugin library, and we'll just call this XRM Nutshell.plugins. So what that did is it gave us a .NET assembly project that we're going to implement some CRM plugins within. So the easiest way to build CRM plugins is to use the CRM Developer Toolkit. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open up my entities, and I'm going to select my parent entity. I'm going to right click and I'm going to select Create Plugin. What this is going to do is going to give you a bunch of options. So plugins can be configured a number of different ways. First, based on the entity. So you want to take some action when this entity is interacted with through the web services layer. In my case, I'm just going to select update, but you can see you can do create, delete, retrieve, when a single record is requested, when multiple records are requested, when you update. So in all those places, you can execute your .NET business logic. I'm going to run it within the context of the calling user, but you have different options here. And then you have these things that we call pipeline stages. And there are three: pre-validation, pre-operation, and post-operation. And the way I like to think about these is before CRM enlists in the database transaction, within the database transaction, and after the database transaction. Obviously, there's certain things certain types of business logic you're going to want to execute before you enlist in the database transaction. And those types of actions are appropriate in pre-validation. Notice though, if I select post operation, then I have the option of switching to asynchronous. And literally all you have to do in order to mark your code, your plugin code to execute asynchronously, is change the execution mode to asynchronous. But I'm going to set this back to synchronous. I'm going to select pre-validation. There are a bunch of other advanced topics that I won't go through, but there's a lot of configuration and optimization that can be done here. But this is enough to kind of get started understanding how plugins work. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And so again, this code will execute anytime the parent entity is updated. And it's going to execute before the database transaction. So go ahead and click OK. And we get a .NET class where we can implement some logic. And that class just gets passed in this thing called the plugin context. And so this is where you execute whatever .NET code is necessary to implement your business logic. Call an external web service, execute some scoring algorithm based on lookup data in CRM. You know, the possibilities are endless. But usually what happens if something goes wrong in your plugin, you're going to throw what's called a plugin execution exception, or an invalid plugin execution exception. So this is the easiest path for me to show you the plugin in action. So I'm just going to hard code throwing an exception. Obviously, you would never do this in production code. You would only throw exceptions when necessary. But the idea here is that you can do what you need to do, and if everything validates or all your code executes successfully, you just let the plugin execution complete. If something goes wrong, a business rule is violated, etc., you can throw invalid plugin execution exception and notify the user. So one more thing I'm going to have to do is sign the assembly. Now, because this is a topic in and of itself, I'm not going to go through much detail about what this means, but hopefully if you're a .NET developer, you understand what signing an assembly means. Once I've got that, I can right click and I can say deploy. Now notice, if I go back to my solution here, I have some new components. I have a .NET plugin assembly, and then I have an SDK message. So plugin assemblies are the .NET DLLs that contain the plugins, and SDK messages are what tell Dynamics CRM's plugin infrastructure to execute the code that lives in that class in that assembly. So now notice if I come over here to this existing parent user and I try to update this, I get a business process error, and in fact the error that I sent from my plugin shows up right there. Now again, this just shows you the mechanics of how plugins work. And again, once you understand the different places you can put your .NET business logic, you then start to understand how you can implement lots of business logic scenarios using CRM plugins. So let's bring this together with an Endon sample. So if I come over here to my geocode map sample and I create a new one of these, and let's say this is the White House and it's 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. And it's 20500. If I save this, notice what happened. So what's actually going on here is we have a combination of web resources and CRM plugins. So the web resource is responsible for the rendering. The CRM plugin is responsible for server-side, making a call out to the Bing Maps web service to geocode the address and put it inside of a hidden field in this form. So let's jump over to Visual Studio to see the code for this in action. So this is a little bit more involved plugin code, but basically what we're doing is we're getting the data that was passed into the plugin from CRM out. We're using some advanced SDK topics like early bound classes to represent the entity. Then I'm just going through and I'm building a Bing Maps REST API call, basically by extracting the data out of the entity that's attempting to be saved. So we basically build up this URL, we make the web service call, and if we have issues, we return it through the plugin. Otherwise, we just populate the value of the latitude and longitude properties of the entity based on the values that come back from the Bing Maps geocoding service. And after we populate that, we end out of the plugin, so now the entity has those values. CRM takes the updates that we provided the entity and it saves it to the database. Okay, so that's the plugin side, right? The part that executes behind the CRM web services. Now let's take a look at our two web pages. So for the interactive map, actually let's take a look at the static map first. So basically, because this HTML is sitting in an iframe inside the CRM form, we do a window.parent to get access to that XRM API that lives in the form. So we do an XRM.page get attribute to get the latitude and longitude values out. And then very similarly, we use the Bing Maps REST API here to get a static image, and then we set the source of the static image to that URL. And that's what causes this static image to load. So that's all client-side JavaScript code, and it's using the latitude and longitude properties that are in the form but are not visible by default, therefore they're hidden in the form. They're available to us programmatically in the form, but you can't actually see them, or the end user can't actually see them. Similarly, if we look at the interactive map, we're doing basically the same thing we did earlier, getting the latitude and longitude values out, but in this case we're using the Bing Maps JavaScript control, which we've referenced up here, and we're just taking that latitude and longitude and adding a push pin to the map. And again, that's client-side HTML code, which basically gets the latitude and longitude from the XRM.page API. All right, so we looked at web resources, we looked at plugins. Let's look at building a custom workflow activity. Okay, so we're back in Visual Studio, and we're going to come in here and we're going to say add new project workflow library. And we'll call this XRM Nutshell Workflow Activities. Click OK. So similarly to plugins, you've got to assign this. So just in the interest of quick demo, I'm just going to call this temp. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say add new item. And under CRM, a workflow activity class. And we'll just call this uppercase.cs. We'll call this uppercase. So this is the human readable information that's going to show up on the workflow designer. And we're going to give it a logical grouping, and I'll just call this dev keydet. So this allows you to group different activities on the design surface. and then we'll uppercase text. Click OK. And so this is a .NET class, very similar to a plugin. It's a little bit more and different boilerplate code. In the interest of time, I've gone ahead and augmented the class with an input value and an output value. So the idea is that this code activity is going to take a string value and uppercase that string value and return it for a power user to use when they're composing a workflow. So if we drop down to the to-do section here, I've just implemented the very simple logic that's going to say, take that value that was passed into the workflow. First we need to get it out, and then we need to set the output value to that input value dot to upper. So if I right click this time and say deploy, our deploy succeeded, so I can come back over to our XRM Nutshell solution. I can look at that workflow. I'll go ahead and deactivate it. And so I'm going to add a step, and notice if I scroll all the way down, you see dev keydet, that's that category that I created, and you'll see my uppercase. So I can click Set Properties here, and the input value is going to be, let's say, the name property of the parent entity that's getting created. Click Save and Close. And then I want to insert after, and I want to add an update record step. And I want to set the parent's name value to the uppercase's output value. Save and close that. All right, so in the end, what we've got here is converting the name value to uppercase, and we did that via this custom workflow activity. Next, what I want to do is talk about reporting. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on reporting. I just want to show that these are, in fact, reporting services report. And if I look at the first one, report1.rdl, and I preview it, it's going to query the database and return some data. If I go back into design view and I double click on the data set here, you'll notice that this is using SQL to query for that data. And as I mentioned earlier, it's using the filtered views that exist in the SQL Server database that CRM creates. And those filtered views are what you query against to ensure that the right security model is applied. Similarly, if I open this one and we preview it, we'll see that it does in fact return data. If I go back to design view and I open up the data set, you'll notice that this case, it's using the fetch data source. And so instead of the query being in SQL, it's in this XML structure. And instead of the report going directly to the SQL Server database, the report actually goes to the CRM Web Services. But once you understand those fundamentals, then it's just SQL Server Reporting Services programming, and you use the CRM SDK plus the Reporting Services SDK to build your custom reports. And then to deploy these to CRM, you literally just do what I showed you in the previous video in terms of creating a report, except instead of using the report wizard, you just upload these files. And then they get deployed to the report server, and they become available to your end users. All right, so we saw the fundamentals around extending the UI using web resources, writing server-side business logic using .NET plugins, and workflow activities. I showed you that reports are nothing more than just SQL Server Reporting Services reports, either querying with SQL against the filtered views or using fetch XML. And while I haven't shown you a tangible example of this integrated application scenario, I will put a link in my blog post for this video series to another blog post I have that walks you through this particular scenario. This concludes part 3 of the series. So hopefully now you have a clear picture of what it means to build a data-centric business application using dynamic CRM, building what people often refer to as XRM applications. I've walked you through defining what a data-centric business application is, building one through point-and-click customization, and finally extending it through the dynamic CRM SDK. There's quite a bit more to learn about using dynamic CRM to build these kinds of applications, but hopefully I've given you enough of an idea of the key components of the framework that enables you to build these data-centric business applications on top of dynamic CRM.